Okay, on screen you're seeing the Bishop Lists book again. I just got it from Amazon and I've read it now. Not, in depth, but enough to get the drift of the book. And I would very, very much recommend you buy it, especially if you're interested or have problems with the so-called doctrine of apostolic succession. Because what this guy does is he traces where it comes from. And I'm going to sort of give you a couple of things that he says that will shock you, does me anyway, but at the same time will kind of detoxify the origin of what most of us know is a lie against the Bible. Okay? It's real obvious to me now that the people at the time this lie was being developed weren't thinking of its implications. So it's really more of a mistake that this lie got developed, and by the time of Constantine it was too far entrenched, so it was just opportunistic to use it. That's my take on this. But again, I think you should read the book yourself. It's Bishop Lists. You can see it there on screen. That screen's going to stay static because I'm just going to continue to talk. Here's the basic tracing of what happened. The first thing that he traces in the book is that all these people writing about so-called apostolic succession are very much thinking in Greek and Roman terms. The whole concept of succession is a succession of an inheritance, physical inheritance. And therefore they are thinking in terms of somebody died, there's a will, and who gets from the will. Of course, what they conveniently ignore is that there was no will left behind. See, that's the whole problem with their doctrine, is that there is nothing in the Bible which is the will and testament, right? Testament means a will, a testator's will. When it says testament, that means somebody dies and leaves behind his wishes. That's what testament means. It also means contract. It also has depositional elements, a lot of things. So in the testament, there is no will left behind as to how anything, if anything, what happens after the apostles die. There's no provision. In fact, the provisions that are there are diametrically opposed. So his first point of departure is what language of succession, as Greeks and Romans understood it, was in their arguments or in the Bible or both. That's his first point of departure, and the answer is the Bible doesn't have the right language. So then his next point of departure is, well, what practices were there? And as he goes through the book, and you've seen me do this in the first 4 videos already, the practices that were there were based on missionary practices, that Paul and the apostles were missionaries. They'd set up churches and then they'd move on. What that left behind was an episkopos, somebody that was like over the house churches, and the idea was for everybody to be on the same doctrinal page. But that's for started churches, new churches, first generation. And there was no provision about an appointment of an episkopos after the apostle dies. The episkopos had to be appointed by the apostle. After the apostle dies, there's no provision. So that was the conundrum there. So that was his second point of departure. And then, because again, he's still pursuing, well, what's the legal basis? And what was the practice legal basis? Okay, well, this is what happened, but there was no provision legally for it to continue that way. And then he goes through, well, what happens if an elder, so-called elder, meaning John, his missions were to different groups. What happens if he's in the area where, after Paul's dead, for example? And there's nothing about that either. Okay? So then his next point is, well, okay, fine, we can't find any practice after the first appointed overseers to indicate anything like an ecclesiastical hierarchy developing. But what we can find is some kind of thought about a hierarchy that begins with Ignatius, but not in the Bible. So then he goes through, how Ignatius, looks at things. And Ignatius doesn't make any kind of reference to a hierarchy. He's just talking about the bishop of the church. Okay? Or the bishop of the city, who he visited. Okay, well, not how they got there, or not what right they had to be there. So then that brought him into, the author, Dr. Williams, brought him into, a conundrum. Okay, well, what tracing do we find of any idea that this should have happened? Because it's not in the Bible. So then he goes back before Ignatius to 1 Clement. And in 1 Clement he finds not a Bible justification, but rather Clement claiming that church replaces Israel, and therefore all of Clement's reasoning out to argue over the Corinthians in 1 Clement is based on Jewish priesthood ideas. Jewish priesthood. As if, I guess, and Dr. Williams doesn't talk about this part. When I read that, I thought, was Hebrews 7 through 10 not in his Bible? Did 1 Clement not have Hebrews 7 through 10? I mean, it's technically possible. But he did have the book of Corinthians. And 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 10 expressly denies what Clement is advocating, even though Clement quotes from 1 Corinthians. Okay? And Dr. Williams goes through some extensive quoting in passage after passage of 1 Clement to show the Jewish analogy, the Jewish high priesthood analogy, is what Clement is using. As if church inherits that. Okay? Which, of course, is just completely against the Bible, the New Testament. But, Dr. Williams is being kind. He's not saying that. He's just saying, this is where he's talking it from, this is where he's talking it from. He's looking at the Jewish priesthood, and he's citing all the verses in 1 Clement to show you that. Which, of course, you can find 1 Clement online. You can read it yourself. Take Pepto-Bismol. So, it becomes really obvious that he's taking the idea of apostolic succession, which term he never uses in 1 Clement. The idea of apostolic succession itself is not used. Instead, it's the idea of a general thing where, the priests of Israel died and were replaced by other priests. And that was a God-given system. And that church inherits that because church is the new Israel. That's 1 Clement's reasoning. Okay. So, okay, so that's the idea in 1 Clement. So then the next in this, so now it becomes a sort of forensic task to say, okay, well, who are these alleged, what do you want to call it? This alleged group who picks up the mantle in Jewish priesthood style, even though we're not Jewish, even though Christ has given us a New Testament. Okay, well, but, where are these lists of people who supposedly occurred in this Hellenistic concept of a successor, like inheriting property? This unbroken lie. Next person that he finds is Hippolytus. Hippolytus actually has listed a couple of names of people that believe the way he did. And he's listing those names in order to counter other Christians who don't believe the way he does, in order to make them heretics and say how bad they are. Okay? And then our next guy is Irenaeus. Okay? And Julius Africanus. And then finally, I forget who the other guys are. There are two others. Anyway, the bottom line is that all those uses of the lists were to defeat other Christians. Okay? They were polemical devices, listing guys on our side, and of course our side is God's side. And if you don't agree with the beliefs that we got, then you aren't on God's side, and you don't go back, and you're not the successor. In other words, it's a usurpation. And of course the idea is New Israel. Okay? Taking over, replacing Israel. You know, replacement theology, the opposite of what Paul says you're supposed to do in Romans 11. What he warned the Romans against in Romans 11. Don't be anti-Semitic. Yeah, well, they are. Now, Dr. Williams is much nicer about all this than I am. And it's not, you know, I'm losing my temper. But the ending story is that Eusebius ends up getting all these lists and sort of manipulates them a little bit, because his purpose is different from the preceding writers of these invented bishops' lists. They're invented people. Okay? Eusebius' purpose is to make Christianity look old. So what Eusebius does is he follows his predecessors in that the predecessor concept of, oh, well, we're built on Israel. We took over from Israel. We replaced Israel. So he has a bunch of lists of the Old Testament Jewish priesthood, and we're the successor to that. So see, we're now an old religion. We're really old. We're not new. We're not guilty of what Diocletian said, some newfangled thing. No, we're come from the earliest antiquity possible. We're real old. And it wasn't until Eusebius that it was actually a concept of apostolic succession. Now, the other interesting thing that Dr. Williams' book comes up with, which really I had no idea, is that, you know, that whole Peter is the rock thing? Nobody used that. In fact, its origin was after the temple got destroyed, well, actually after James died, everybody scattered. All the apostles left Jerusalem, meaning the 12 who were, you know, apostles to the Jews. They left Jerusalem, and they had been associating the whole idea of apostolic succession with the house of David and a comeback for Israel. Now, the Antioch churches were initially established under the aegis of the church at Jerusalem. So when this killing of James occurred and everybody got nervous, and the Jerusalem church left Jerusalem, the Antioch church kind of didn't want to admit that they were associated with Jerusalem church anymore, because, you know, they could get hurt from Rome, because now the Jerusalem church was trying to build Israel again, and their whole idea of making James the head of the church was because he was the brother of the Lord, and what they really wanted was a monarchy again, you know, priest-king kind of thing. So the Antioch church wanted to distance itself from the Jerusalem church that has now moved out of Jerusalem. And so in order to do that, they say, well, you know, Peter was the guy who founded us. So Peter's our rock. We claim from Peter. Never mind that while Peter was alive, and while the Jerusalem church was in Jerusalem, they were associating themselves more with the Jerusalem church than they were associating themselves with Peter. But see, now that the Jerusalem church is persona non grata in a political football, because, Rome might come down on them since they're now using the idea of Christianity in order to foster a political comeback for Israel. Well, Antioch's got to distance themselves from the Jews, you see. So that's how the whole Peter thingy comes up. Isn't that cute? Yeah, and that explains why 1 Clement never says Peter's the rock. Okay, 1 Clement comes out the very year that John is exiled to Patmos, and you know what? Clement never mentions John's name. Now, in Roman culture, when you don't mention somebody's name, especially if that person is important and famous, you're snubbing that person. John's name is nowhere in 1 Clement. Nowhere. Paul's name is mentioned twice. And I mean, you're talking about a 50-some chapter letter. Goes on and 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 on. Real flowery prose. The kind of way a person talks when he's trying to get you to like him and buy what he sells. Yeah. Peter's name is only mentioned once. And just in a very general concept. Oh, Peter endured, suffering. Doesn't mention how, doesn't mention why, it's really vague. And Paul's name is mentioned twice. First time Clement is quoting 1 Corinthians, which he obviously didn't read, because he's quoting it to his own shame, because 1 Corinthians 15 tells him that everything he's writing is a lie. So he obviously didn't read that chapter. And the second time he quotes about Paul is just to say that Paul suffered a lot too. Also very vague, very dismissive. No mention of James, no mention of Matthew, no mention of Mark, no mention of John, who in the very time Clement is talking, and it's very clear he's writing as a result of the persecution under Domitian. The very time he's talking, he's warning them not to reject his authority, lest Rome come down on the Corinthians. You know what that means. He might snitch. Anyway, hope this is enough.